The engine alarms did not sound like alarms anymore. They sounded like screaming metal, and Daniel Hale had stopped counting the warning lights blinking across the console. The small survey ship shook so hard that his teeth rattled, and through the cracked window, he could see chunks of debris flying past like angry hail. They had wandered too close to an old asteroid field while mapping a forgotten star system, and something out there had torn a hole straight through the hull. He shouted at his crewmates to brace, but the words were lost in the roar of tearing metal. The ship spun, flipped, and slammed into the surface of a moon none of them had ever seen on any chart. Fire spread through the cabin. Sparks rained from broken panels. Daniel remembered gripping his harness so tightly his knuckles turned white, and then everything went black. When he woke, the silence was the first thing that scared him. No engines humming, no voices, no beeping instruments. Just wind blowing through a gash in the ship's side and the faint creak of settling metal. He tried to move, and pain shot through his ribs, sharp and burning. Slowly, he unbuckled himself and crawled through the wreckage, calling out names. No one answered. He found his crewmates one by one, and none of them were breathing. Daniel sat there for a long time, alone in the wreck, staring at the bodies of people he had known for years. There was no medic left, no captain, no engineer. Just him, a man trained to read star maps and log soil samples, now stranded on a moon that did not even have a name in any database. He forced himself to stand. Sitting still felt like giving up, and giving up felt like joining the dead. Outside, the moon looked strange and beautiful in a cold, distant way. The sky had a faint purple tint, and twin suns hung low near the horizon, casting long shadows across jagged black rock. The air was breathable, thin but survivable, according to the cracked reading on his wrist device. That was the only piece of good news he had gotten all day. He spent the first hours checking the wreck for anything useful. The main communicator was smashed beyond repair, but a small emergency beacon still blinked weakly, sending out a signal that might take years to reach anyone, if it reached anyone at all. He packed what supplies he could carry: water purifiers, ration packs, a medkit, a multi-tool, and a length of rope, and began walking, following a valley that looked like it might lead to shelter. The walk was harder than he expected. His ribs ached with every step, and the thin air made him dizzy if he moved too fast. Rocks crumbled under his boots as he climbed down into the valley, and more than once he had to stop and catch his breath against a boulder. But something pulled him forward, a strange warmth in the air that grew stronger the deeper he went, like the ground itself was breathing heat. He found the source near sunset. The valley opened into a wide basin filled with steaming vents and glowing cracks in the rock, geothermal heat rising from deep below the surface. And nestled among the warm stones, half hidden in natural hollows, were eggs. Not birds' eggs, not anything he recognized from any textbook. These were massive, each one taller than a grown man, with a leathery shell that shimmered faintly under the dying light. Daniel stood frozen at the edge of the basin, staring. He counted 11 eggs in total, arranged in a rough circle around the largest heat vent, as if placed there on purpose. There was no sign of any parent nearby, no tracks, no movement except steam curling into the evening air. He realized, with a chill that had nothing to do with the cold, that he was looking at a nest, and whatever had laid these eggs was nowhere to be found. He approached carefully, his boots crunching on loose gravel, and placed a hand against the nearest shell. It was warm, almost hot, and beneath his palm he could feel the faintest pulse of movement inside. Something was alive in there. Something was growing. He pulled his hand back, unsure what to think. Back home, he had read stories about ancient reptilian species that once ruled distant systems before wars and disasters wiped most of them out. He had never imagined he would find proof of one, let alone stumble into its last surviving nest, injured and alone on a nameless moon. Night fell quickly, and with it came sounds he did not like. Distant howls echoed across the rocks, low and hungry, growing louder as the twin suns disappeared completely. Daniel's stomach tightened. Out here, with no ship, no crew, and no weapons besides a small multi-tool in his own two hands, he was in no position to fight anything. But leaving the eggs unprotected felt wrong in a way he could not fully explain. He gathered loose rocks and broken metal panels from a smaller piece of wreckage he had passed earlier and began stacking them around the edge of the nest, forming a crude wall. It was not much, but it was something. As he worked in the dim light, he found himself talking quietly to the eggs, the way people sometimes talk to plants or empty rooms, more to hear a voice than to expect an answer. By the time the wall was finished, exhaustion had caught up with him completely. He sat down with his back against the warm stone, watching the shadows beyond the basin for any sign of movement. His ribs throbbed, his legs ached, and sleep pulled at him with heavy hands. But he forced his eyes to stay open a little longer, listening to the distant howls fade and return, like something out there was testing the edges of the valley. For the first time since the crash, Daniel Hale did not feel completely alone. He had 11 strange, silent companions who could not speak, could not move, and did not even know he existed. Yet somehow, sitting there in the dark with his makeshift wall and his aching body, he made a quiet decision. He was not going to let anything happen to this nest. Whatever came next, whatever this place truly was, he would protect it for as long as he had strength left to stand. 3 days after the crash, Daniel Hale had turned the wrecked survey ship into a toolbox. He stripped panels, wires, and small machine parts from the hull, carrying them piece by piece down into the valley where the eggs rested. His ribs still ached with every trip, but the work gave him something to focus on besides the loneliness pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. Out here, silence had a way of getting louder the longer he sat with it. He built the wall around the nest higher, using flat rocks stacked with metal sheets wedged between them. It would not stop a determined predator, but it might slow one down, and a few seconds could matter. He also rigged a simple alarm from a broken sensor unit, something that would beep loudly if it detected motion nearby. The first night he tested it, the sound startled him so badly he nearly fell into the geothermal vent himself. After that, he adjusted the sensitivity so it would not scream at every gust of wind. Food quickly became a problem. His rations would not last more than 2 weeks if he was careful, and there was no way to know when, or if, anyone would find his beacon signal. He forced himself to explore beyond the valley during daylight hours, moving slowly because of his injuries, searching for anything that looked edible. He found strange purple moss growing near the warm rocks, and, after testing a small piece and waiting an anxious hour to see if it made him sick, decided it was safe enough to eat in small amounts. It tasted bitter and dry, nothing like real food, but it kept his stomach from twisting with hunger. At night, he stayed close to the nest, wrapped in a thermal blanket salvaged from the wreck. The warmth from the geothermal vents helped him survive the freezing temperatures once the twin suns vanished behind the horizon. He noticed something odd during those long nights, a faint humming sound coming from inside the eggs, low and rhythmic, almost like breathing set to music. At first he thought it was his imagination or the wind moving through the rocks, but the pattern was too steady, too alive. He started talking to the eggs without really meaning to. It began as short mutters while he worked, commenting on the weather or complaining about his sore ribs. But as the days passed, the habit grew into something more. He told them about his life before the crash, about the small farming town he grew up in, about how he had joined the survey program because he wanted to see something the history books had never written about. He told them the names of his dead crewmates, speaking each one carefully, like a small funeral no one else would ever attend. The humming from the eggs seemed to shift slightly whenever he spoke, rising and falling in a way that almost matched his tone. He knew it was probably nothing, some strange biological reflex, but it made him feel less alone all the same. He began sitting closer to the nest during his rest hours, resting his hand against the warm shells, feeling the faint pulse of movement beneath. On the 5th night, the howls from before returned, closer than ever. Daniel woke to the motion sensor screeching, and he scrambled up with his multi-tool clutched in one shaking hand, heart hammering against his bruised ribs. Beyond the low wall, he could see shapes moving in the darkness, low and quick, with eyes that caught the dim starlight like small green fires. There were 3 of them, thin, wolf-like creatures with too many legs, sniffing at the edge of the basin. He grabbed a metal pipe he had set aside earlier and banged it against a loose sheet of hull plating, creating a harsh, ringing clang that echoed across the rocks. The creatures froze, startled, then scattered back into the darkness, unwilling to risk whatever strange noise had disturbed them. Daniel stood there for a long time afterward, breathing hard, watching the shadows for any sign of return. None came that night, but he understood clearly that the wall alone would not be enough forever. The next morning, exhausted but determined, he expanded his defenses. He rigged noisemakers around the perimeter using scrap metal and loose wire, so that anything brushing against the barrier would trigger a loud clatter. He sharpened pieces of broken hull plating into crude spikes and planted them at angles along the approach path, hidden beneath loose gravel. It was slow, careful work, and his body protested every movement, but he pushed through the pain because stopping felt like leaving a door unlocked. As he worked, he noticed the eggs seemed to react to his presence more clearly now. When he was nearby, the humming grew steady and calm. When he wandered too far collecting supplies, it would rise into something almost anxious, a higher-pitched hum that made him hurry back despite his exhaustion. He began to wonder if the creatures inside could somehow sense him, recognize him, even care whether he stayed or left. It was a strange thought, and yet it settled something restless inside his chest. His health continued to decline in small, worrying ways. The cut along his side, stitched roughly with medkit supplies, had started to look inflamed. His sleep grew shorter and more broken, plagued by dreams of the crash mixed with the low hum of the nest. He knew he needed real medical care, proper food, rest in a real bed. None of that was available to him here. All he had was the valley, the warmth of the vents, and 11 eggs that had somehow become the only thing keeping him going. One evening, as the twin suns dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in deep orange and violet, Daniel sat against the low wall he had built, listening to the familiar hum rise and fall around him. He pressed his palm against the nearest shell and felt the pulse beneath it, steady and strong, growing stronger every day. Whatever happened to him, whatever this place truly was, he understood now that leaving was no longer something he even wanted to consider. He was not just surviving anymore. He was guarding something, and for the first time since the crash, that purpose felt like enough of a reason to keep breathing through the pain, keep waking up each morning, and keep fighting to see one more sunrise over the valley. The storm rolled in without warning on the 12th night, thick black clouds swallowing the twin suns hours before sunset. Daniel Hale noticed the sudden drop in temperature first, a cold that cut through his thermal blanket like it was made of paper. Then came the wind, howling through the valley and rattling the metal sheets of his makeshift wall. He had faced bad weather before during survey missions, but something about this storm felt wrong, heavy, like the whole moon was holding its breath. He checked on the eggs, running his hand across each shell the way he had grown used to doing every few hours. The humming inside them had changed that night, sharper and more urgent than before, and he did not need any scientific explanation to understand that something was different. He tightened the ropes holding his shelter tarp in place and reinforced the noisemakers along the perimeter, working quickly as the first heavy raindrops began to fall, thick and dark, hissing where they struck the warm geothermal rocks. The howl started an hour into the storm, but they sounded different this time. Not the quick, nervous yips of the small wolf like scavengers he had driven off before. This was a single, deep roar that rolled across the valley like thunder, low enough that Daniel felt it in his chest before he consciously heard it. He grabbed his sharpened pipe and pressed his back against the stone wall of the nest, scanning the darkness beyond the rain. It came out of the storm like a nightmare given shape, a massive creature covered in thick black scales, easily 3 times his height, with long claws that dug deep gouges into the rocky ground as it moved. Its eyes glowed a dull red, locked directly on the warmth radiating from the nest. This was no scavenger testing the edges of unfamiliar territory. This was an apex predator, drawn by the heat signature that had kept both Daniel and the eggs alive for nearly 2 weeks, and it looked hungry enough to tear through anything standing in its way. Daniel's mind raced through his limited options. He had no real weapon, no way to call for help, and a body that was already running on fumes after days of poor food and worse sleep. But behind him, beneath the stone and metal wall he had built with his own hands, 11 lives waited, unable to defend themselves, unable to even understand the danger closing in. Running was not something he considered, not even for a moment. He grabbed the emergency power core he had salvaged from the wreck days earlier, a small cylindrical device meant to jump-start a dead engine. and began wiring it hastily to a cluster of loose metal and broken glass he had gathered as a last resort defense. His hands shook, partly from cold, partly from fear, but he forced himself to work steadily, remembering every scrap of engineering training he had picked up over the years. If he timed this wrong, it would do nothing but waste his only card. The creature let out another roar and charged, closing the distance across the basin far faster than something its size should have been able to move. Daniel threw himself sideways, rolling behind a jagged rock as the beast slammed into his outer wall, scattering rocks and metal sheets like they were made of paper. Pain flared through his already damaged ribs as he hit the ground hard, but he forced himself back to his feet, gripping the wired device tightly. He shouted, waving his arms and banging his pipe against a metal plate to draw the creature's attention away from the nest entrance. It worked. The beast turned toward him, red eyes narrowing, and charged again. Daniel scrambled backward, luring it toward the trap he had set near the valley's narrow entrance point, where jagged rocks created a natural funnel. His lungs burned, his legs screamed with exhaustion, but he kept moving, kept shouting, kept the creature's focus locked entirely on him. When the beast entered the narrow passage, Daniel triggered the wired device. The explosion was smaller than he had hoped, but it was enough, a burst of fire and shrapnel that tore into the creature's side and sent it stumbling with a furious, pained roar. It thrashed wildly, smashing against the rock walls, and for a moment Daniel believed he had actually won. Then a massive claw caught him across the chest, throwing him hard into a boulder before the creature, wounded and limping, finally retreated back into the storm, unwilling to risk further injury. Daniel lay there for a long moment, rain pouring down on his face, pain radiating through every part of his body. He knew, with a strange, distant clarity, that something inside him had broken badly this time. Breathing hurt in a new, sharper way. Moving hurt more. But somewhere beyond the pain, a small, stubborn voice reminded him that the nest was still exposed, the wall was in ruins, and the storm was far from over. He forced himself up, dragging his broken body across the muddy ground, using rocks and debris to pull himself forward inch by inch. Every movement sent fresh waves of agony through his chest, but he did not stop, could not stop. Not while 11 eggs sat unprotected in the open with a wounded predator still somewhere nearby. He reached the nest as lightning split the sky, illuminating the valley in brief, harsh flashes of white light. With the last of his strength, Daniel gathered loose rocks and fallen metal sheets, rebuilding what he could of the broken wall, sealing gaps with anything he could reach. His hands were raw and bleeding, his vision swimming in and out of focus, but he kept working, kept stacking, kept protecting the only thing that still felt worth protecting. When the wall was as solid as his failing body could make it, he crawled into the narrow gap between the stones and the nearest egg, curling his body against the warm shell, shielding the entrance with everything he had left. The storm raged on through the night, wind screaming across the valley, rain hammering the stones. Daniel's breathing grew shallow, each inhale a battle against the pain in his chest. He kept his eyes on the darkness beyond the wall, watching for any sign of the creature's return, refusing to let sleep or unconsciousness take him while there was still a threat. But as the hours passed and his strength faded further, his thoughts drifted toward home, toward his crewmates, toward the strange, quiet peace he had found in this valley among creatures who would never truly know his name. As the first pale light of dawn began creeping over the storm clouds, the rain finally softened into a gentle drizzle. Daniel felt his body grow heavy in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion. His hand rested against the warm shell beside him, and for just a moment, he thought he felt it pulse harder, almost as if responding to him. He allowed himself a faint, tired smile, the first in days. The nest was still standing. The eggs were still safe. Whatever happened next, he had done what he came into this valley to do. Daniel Hale closed his eyes as the first thin cracks began forming along the shells around him, and did not open them again. The rain had stopped completely by the time the first shell cracked open, leaving the valley wrapped in a soft gray mist that clung low to the ground. Steam curled up from the geothermal vents, drifting past the broken stone wall and the still figure lying beside the nest. Inside the largest egg, A small clawed foot pushed weakly against the shell, breaking it apart piece by piece, until a tiny reptilian head emerged, blinking against the dim morning light for the very first time. The hatchling was small compared to what it would one day become, its scales a deep shade of blue-gray, still damp and soft from the shell. It made a quiet, questioning sound, somewhere between a chirp and a low hum, and turned its head slowly, taking in the strange new world around it. The first thing it saw was not sky or rock or the distant twin suns breaking through the clouds. The first thing it saw was Daniel, curled protectively around the base of the nest, unmoving. One by one, the other eggs began to crack, shells splitting under the determined efforts of the creatures inside. 10 more hatchlings emerged over the next hour, stumbling on unsteady legs, shaking dampness from their small wings, calling out to each other in soft, overlapping hums. They gathered instinctively near the center of the nest, drawn together by some deep, shared understanding neither humans nor scientists had ever documented before. What none of them could have known, not even Daniel in his final hours, was that the Skarn WRMS possessed an ability unlike almost any other species in the known galaxy. In the earliest moments after hatching, their minds remained open in a way that would close forever within hours, absorbing fragments of memory, emotion, and identity from any living or recently living being nearby. It was an ancient survival trait, passed down through countless generations, meant to preserve the knowledge and wisdom of guardians who protected the nest when the true parents could not. As the hatchlings pressed close against Daniel's still form, something passed between them that had no name in any human language. Flashes of memory rippled through their newly formed minds, disjointed and fragmented, but powerful all the same. A small farming town under a golden sky. The laughter of crewmates now long gone. The roar of a massive predator in the storm. The burning ache of loneliness, and beneath it, a quiet, stubborn warmth that refused to let go, even in the final moments. And through it all, echoing louder than anything else, was a single sound repeated over and over in his own voice during those long, quiet nights when he had spoken to them without expecting an answer. His name, not spoken as a word with meaning to them yet, but absorbed as a feeling, an identity, a marker of safety and protection woven into the very first moments of their new lives. The hatchlings did not understand language the way humans did, not fully, not yet. But they understood pattern and repetition and the deep emotional weight carried in a sound spoken with love and sacrifice. Slowly, tentatively, the largest of the hatchlings opened its small mouth and made a sound that was not quite a hum and not quite a word, but somewhere in between. It came out broken and strange, but unmistakably close to 2 familiar syllables. Hail. The others picked it up almost immediately, repeating the sound back and forth between themselves in overlapping chirps and hums, as if testing how it felt, how it fit into the strange new world they had just been born into. It became something more than a word to them. It became an anchor, the first true piece of identity they carried out of the shell, tied inseparably to warmth, safety, and the still, quiet figure curled protectively around their nest. The hatchlings spent their first hours pressed close together near the geothermal vents, instinctively seeking warmth the way their inherited memories told them to. They were fragile, their scales soft, and their wings too weak to do more than twitch uselessly at their sides. Survival on this moon would not be easy, especially without the guardian who had kept the predators at bay for nearly 2 weeks. But something in the fragmented memories they carried gave them more than simple animal instinct. It gave them caution. It gave them awareness of danger, of traps, of the value of walls and hidden paths and quiet vigilance through the night. As the sun rose higher and the mist began to clear, the largest hatchling, the one who had spoken the name first, climbed unsteadily onto a nearby rock and looked out over the valley beyond the broken wall. Its small nostrils flared, catching unfamiliar scents carried on the wind, some of them faint traces of the wounded predator that had retreated into the storm the night before. A low, protective hum rose from its throat, quiet but firm, an echo of a feeling it had inherited but could not yet fully explain. The other hatchlings gathered near the base of the rock, watching their sibling with the same instinctive attentiveness, as if recognizing something different in the way it carried itself. It was not larger by much, and not obviously stronger, but there was a steadiness to its movements, a calm alertness that mirrored something ancient and human in nature, something none of them could name, but all of them felt. Throughout that first day, the hatchlings explored the edges of the nest cautiously, staying close to the warmth of the vents and returning frequently to touch their small snouts against Daniel's still form, as if checking, again and again, that the source of their earliest memories was truly there. They did not understand death the way humans did. To them, he remained part of the nest itself, woven into their earliest sense of home, safety, and identity. As evening approached and the twin suns began sinking toward the horizon, the hatchlings settled together near the vents, forming a small, huddled circle around the spot where their guardian had made his final stand. The valley was quiet now, the storm long past, the predator gone, at least for the moment. Survival would not be easy in the days ahead, but for the first time since their shells had cracked open, the fragile new lives of the Scarn WIRMS carried something powerful with them into an uncertain future. They carried a name, absorbed not from books or teachings, but from the raw, final moments of a man who had given everything to protect them. And though none of them could yet understand the full weight of what that name meant, they understood, in the deep and instinctive way only newly hatched creatures could, that it belonged to them now, and that they would carry it forward, wherever their lives eventually led them beyond this quiet, steaming valley. 6 years passed on the nameless moon before the sky finally brought visitors again. In that time, the valley had changed. What was once a fragile nest guarded by broken metal and stacked stones had grown into something closer to a stronghold, shaped not by human hands this time, but by the very creatures who had hatched there. The 11 Scarn WIRMS had grown into powerful, intelligent beings, far larger than anyone from Daniel Hale's old survey program could have ever predicted, their scales now a deep, storm-colored blue that shimmered faintly under the twin suns. They had not simply survived. They had thrived, learning to hunt, to build, to defend their territory against every predator that once threatened their fragile shells. The largest among them, the one who had spoken the very first fragmented word after hatching, had grown into a clear leader, taller than the others, with a long scar along one wing from an early battle with a wandering scavenger pack. The other WIRMS deferred to it instinctively, following its lead during hunts and territorial disputes, though none of them fully understood why they trusted it so completely. Their behavior remained unlike anything recorded about the species before the near extinction of their kind. They built shelters using deliberate structural patterns instead of simple burrows. They set traps along common predator paths, hidden beneath loose gravel in ways eerily similar to old human survival tactics. And most strikingly, they continued to hum the name hail to each other during quiet moments, especially near the warm stones where their guardian's body had long since become part of the valley's soil, hum the way a small child might repeat a comforting word learned before they could fully speak. The human patrol ship that entered the system that day was not searching for dragons. It was investigating a faint, ancient distress signal that had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, continued transmitting weekly for years on backup power cells no one thought could last that long. The ship's commander, a cautious woman named Elias Rourke, had led enough remote system surveys to know that old signals rarely led anywhere good. Most of the time, they found wreckage and bones. She did not expect what greeted her ship as it descended toward the valley. The WIRMS noticed the ship long before it landed, its unfamiliar shape and sound triggering an instinctive wariness passed down through their inherited memories. They gathered near the ridge overlooking the valley, watching the strange metal vessel settle onto the rocky ground with cautious, alert eyes. Elias ordered her small team to stay close to the ship, weapons ready but lowered, as they stepped out into the thin, cool air of the unfamiliar moon. For a long, tense moment, neither side moved. The WIRMS studied the humans with sharp, intelligent eyes, clearly assessing them the way one might assess a potential threat, or perhaps something else entirely. Then, slowly, the lead WIRM stepped forward from the ridge, wings partially spread, not in an aggressive display, but in a manner that felt strangely deliberate, almost like a greeting. It opened its jaw and released a low, resonant hum, followed by a sound that made every member of the patrol team freeze in place. Hail. The word came out rough and strange, shaped by a throat built for entirely different sounds, but unmistakably clear. Elias felt a chill run down her spine as the creature repeated the name again, softer this time, almost questioning, as it looked directly at her. She glanced back at her team, seeing the same confusion and disbelief on their faces. None of them had any idea what to make of a massive, dragon-like creature speaking a human name on an uncharted moon light years from any known colony. Cautiously, Elias raised a hand, palm open, a gesture she hoped would translate as peaceful across species. The WYRM tilted its head, studying the movement, then mimicked it awkwardly with one clawed foot, pressing it flat against the ground. It was clumsy, almost comical, but the intention behind it was unmistakable. This creature was trying to communicate, trying to bridge an impossible gap between two completely different forms of life. Over the following days, as the patrol team cautiously explored the valley under the watchful eyes of the WYRMS, pieces of the story slowly came together. They found the wreckage of Daniel's old survey ship, rusted and half-buried beneath years of windblown dust. They found personal logs, partially recovered from a damaged data drive, detailing his final days protecting the nest. And they found the quiet, steaming basin where 11 eggs had once rested, now transformed into a place the WYRMS clearly treated as sacred ground. Elias sat for hours reviewing the recovered logs back aboard the ship, listening to Daniel's tired, determined voice describe his growing bond with the eggs, his worsening injuries, his stubborn refusal to leave despite every rational reason to try. The final entry, recorded the night of the storm, was barely audible, filled with static and the sound of Daniel's labored breathing, ending with a simple, exhausted promise to protect the nest for as long as he had strength left. She stepped back outside the following morning and found the lead WYRM waiting near the ship. As if it somehow understood, she now carried a piece of understanding it desperately wanted to share. It lowered its massive head close to her level, and she reached out, hesitating only a moment, before placing her hand gently against its scaled snout. The WYRM let out a slow, steady hum, calm and warm, nothing like the defensive sounds it had made on their first encounter. Word spread quickly among the patrol crew, and eventually back through official channels, of an entire species inheriting fragments of human memory and identity through their unique hatching process. Scientists and officials back in human space debated the implications for months, but for Elias, standing in that quiet valley surrounded by creatures who carried a stranger's sacrifice etched into the very core of their identity, the answer felt simpler than any official report could capture. Daniel Hale had died alone, believing his final act would mean nothing beyond a quiet, forgotten valley on a nameless moon. Instead, he had become something far greater, a founding memory woven into the minds of an entire species, carried forward not through statues or monuments, but through the living, breathing creatures he had given everything to protect. As the patrol ship prepared to leave the system days later, promising to return with proper support and recognition for what had been discovered, the WRMS gathered along the ridge, watching the vessel rise into the sky, humming his name one final time in unison, a sound that echoed across the valley long after the ship had disappeared among the stars. News of the discovery spread through human colonial space faster than anyone expected, carried not through official broadcasts at first, but through the excited, disbelieving stories told by every member of Elias Rourke's patrol crew to anyone willing to listen. A species of massive, intelligent dragons, nearly extinct, discovered on a forgotten moon, carrying the memory and name of a single human survey worker who had died protecting their nest. It sounded like the kind of story told around campfires, exaggerated with each retelling, except every detail checked out under careful scientific review. Within a year, the moon that had once existed without any name on any chart became officially recognized as Hale's Rest, a name chosen unanimously by the small council formed to oversee first contact protocols with the Skarn WYRMS. The valley where Daniel had made his final stand became a protected site, carefully studied but never disturbed beyond what was necessary, out of respect for what both humans and WYRMS now considered sacred ground. The relationship between the two species grew slowly at first, built on cautious visits, careful communication, and the patient work of researchers determined to understand the WIRMS without ever treating them as mere animals or resources. The WIRMS, for their part, showed a level of trust toward humans that surprised even the most optimistic scientists, a trust rooted deeply in the fragmented memories they carried from their earliest moments of life. To them, humanity was not a foreign species to be feared. Humanity was family, tied irreversibly to the guardian who had shaped their very identity. As human colonial expansion continued pushing further into unclaimed systems, the WIRMS proved to be extraordinary allies. Their natural resilience allowed them to survive in harsh environments that challenged even the most advanced human technology, and their intelligence, combined with inherited fragments of tactical thinking passed down from Daniel's final days, made them invaluable partners in scouting dangerous, uncharted worlds. More than that, though, they became a living reminder of what a single, quiet act of sacrifice could grow into, given enough time and enough heart. The lead WIRM, the first to speak Daniel's name after hatching, eventually became something like a bridge between the two species, traveling alongside human survey teams to newly discovered systems. Its massive form a comforting and formidable presence during expeditions into unknown territory. Researchers eventually gave it a simpler name for ease of communication, though among its own kind, it remained known only through the deep, resonant hum that had first shaped its identity beside a dying man in a storm-battered valley. Years passed, and the original 11 hatchlings grew old enough to nest themselves, continuing a cycle none of them had been taught directly, but somehow understood instinctively, passed down through the strange inheritance that defined their species. Each new clutch of eggs hatched with fragments of memory drawn not only from their immediate parents, but distant echoes of Daniel's original sacrifice, diluted slightly with each generation, yet never fully disappearing. Newly hatched WRMS across different nesting grounds still occasionally hummed his name during their earliest hours of life, a quiet, ancient thread connecting them all back to a single, defining moment in a valley on a forgotten moon. Human colonies near Hale's Rest grew accustomed to the sight of WRMS flying alongside survey ships and transport vessels, their massive wings casting long shadows over settlements that had once feared such creatures might pose a threat. Instead, they became protectors in their own right, watching over vulnerable outposts the same way Daniel had once watched over their ancestors' fragile shells. Parents began telling their children stories about the lonely survey worker who gave his life to protect a nest of strange eggs, stories that grew simpler and more legendary with each passing generation, but never lost the core truth at their center. Elias Rourke, now leading a much larger division overseeing human WIRM relations, often returned to Hale's Rest during quiet moments between assignments. She would walk the familiar path down into the valley, past the rebuilt markers commemorating the original nest site, and sit near the warm geothermal stones where it had all begun. The lead WIRM, older now but still fiercely alert, would often join her, resting nearby in comfortable silence, the two of them sharing a quiet understanding that needed no further words. On one such visit, nearly 15 years after the original discovery, Elias found herself present for the hatching of a new clutch at a secondary nesting ground established further from the original valley, a site the WIRMS had chosen and prepared entirely on their own. She watched as the first small shell cracked open, revealing a tiny, damp hatchling blinking against unfamiliar light for the very first time. It stumbled forward on unsteady legs, made a soft, questioning sound, and looked toward the small gathering of humans and WIRMS watching nearby. Then, in a voice too young and rough to form the word clearly, but unmistakable all the same, the hatchling repeated the sound its entire species had carried forward for generations, a name given not through teaching, but through inheritance, through memory, through sacrifice. Hail! Elias felt tears gather in her eyes as she watched the small creature take its first uncertain steps into a world shaped, in ways it could never fully understand, by a man who had died light years away and generations ago, believing his final act would be forgotten in a quiet, empty valley. Instead, That act had become something far larger, a bond stretching across an entire species, carried forward into every new generation, whispered in the first breath of every hatchling born beneath the twin suns of Hale's Rest. Above the nesting ground, human transport ships and WIRM formations flew together in loose, easy patterns, a common sight now across this stretch of space, a quiet symbol of two species who had found unexpected kinship through loss and sacrifice. The story of Daniel Hale, once a forgotten survey worker facing death alone on a nameless moon, had become something no monument or history book could fully capture. It lived on instead in the deepest instincts of an entire species, carried forward endlessly among the stars, one hatchling, one whispered name, one generation at a time.